We're once again excited to have law professor Michael Geist return to discuss many issues in the news these days. He is the University of Ottawa Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law. Welcome back to Boom and Bust, Michael.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
So we'll just, obviously the elephant in the room is the Online News Act. Can you go over the latest for our audience on where that stands?
Yeah, so the government, introduced and then ultimately passed that legislation, Bill C-18, or the Online News Act, back in June. It has now received royal assent. There are regulations that there are regulations both from the government and from the regulator, the CRTC. The government's regulations, which are needed for the law to take effect, are currently the subject of some consultation. But regardless, the government has made clear, and the legislation makes clear, that it must take effect by mid-December. So it's on a bit of a fast track, and we've seen the responses from at least Meta, and are likely to see a response from Google in the not too distant future.
What's their major beef with the legislation?
Well, fundamentally, they argue that a law that is premised on payments for links is simply deeply flawed and really ought to be viewed as a non-starter. So I don't think it's about whether or not they're going to be regulated. I think there's an increasing acceptance that regulation is needed in this space. It's not even about the prospect of some kind of payments into the system, although Meta does make the argument that they say, listen, all that we have from a news perspective are news links that are posted by media outlets themselves. We drive traffic back to those media outlets. The notion that we ought to be paying the media for that strikes them as enormously problematic. So both have expressed real concern about a system based on payments for links. And as we've started to see the government flesh that out a bit through regulation, they've got additional concerns that basically say that, listen, the government, in the case of Google, is looking for 4% of their search revenues to be handed over to media companies. And that's at a minimum. It could go even higher than that. And they say if you establish that kind of standard, you're talking about potentially on a global basis, billions of dollars just for linking to news.
Yeah, and that's the point, that this legislation is could be a template for other jurisdictions wanting to get on the gravy train, as it were. So this has deep impacts for both Meta and Google, and possibly other platforms as well.
It does. I mean, I think at the end of the day, the principle that's established, the notion that there ought to be payments for links in this way, I think does create real issues. Part of it is, of course, the cost specifically to the sector. But part of it also is, of course, if you start saying that, yes, you have to pay for links, for sending traffic back to that original source, it's not clear that it ends with media. Health information is important, and that sector could use more money. Why not pay for links to health information? And the education sector needs money, and it's important. Why not pay for those kinds of links? And so suddenly, one of the core principles around how we rely on information online, that kind of free flow online through linking, faces some real risks if you take the principle that the mere act of linking is itself an act that requires some kind of compensation.
Do you think that the government's bluff has been called on this, though? There was a call for a boycott of Facebook and Meta services. That didn't seem to go very far. Is this now as kind of a failed law before it even gets started?
Yeah, I think it is a failed law. It's interesting that you framed the question as the government's bluff, because so often this was framed as Facebook or Meta was bluffing and that they would come back to the table. The government really didn't seem to have a plan B at all. I mean, their expectation was that, in fact, it was a bluff. They looked at the experience in Australia in particular and said, well, listen, in Australia, they came back to the table, ultimately reached a deal. Surely they're going to do the same thing in Canada. I think they misread the market. I think they misread the importance of news online. And at the end of the day, they simply rejected repeated and very consistent position from Meta, which was, listen, if you base this on payments for links, we will stop linking to news. And the implications, as I think many Canadians know, have been really significant.
Yes, everybody's noticing that their Instagram and Facebook feeds, when you go to a news source, including the news forum, unfortunately, there's just a little symbol with a line through it. So we've got about 15 seconds before the break. Anything else you want to add to that?
Well, I just to quickly highlight that when we talk about blocking news links on that site, we're talking not just about a Canadian news, but the way the
Yes.
law is structured, it's all news. And again, that was a government's choice. They could have had a different choice, and instead they kind of pushed the envelope, and now we're paying the price.
We're going to return with our guest after this break. Please stay with us.